Thanks for having me along this morning. It's lovely to be here. I was absolutely delighted to be asked to address you today. Is it too much blowing my trumpet to add to that list that my book has now also been shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards and is a finalist in the Walkley Awards as well? So I do that by way, in a sense, of being able to spruik the value of the Stella Prize, which I believe owes a great deal of gratitude to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund for establishing it in its first year. So what I'd like to do this morning briefly, they've given me 5 minutes to speak, and actually, to tell you the truth, I don't know how to speak for 5 minutes. I spoke at a dinner at Cranlana last night, the Myer estate. I was asked to speak for 15. I think I spoke for 45. But I'm not going to keep you here. We all have very busy lives during the day. But what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit about my book, firstly, and how I came to write it, and then how the Stella Prize has, what that has done, winning the Stella Prize has done for me and for my book. So firstly, my book is called The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. It's a book that took me 10 years to research and write. When I first started to talk about the idea for this book with some of my academic colleagues, mostly older men of a certain generation and disposition, they said to me, "What could you possibly write about Eureka that hasn't already been said before?" In the last 150 years of scholarship, basically every historian who had come before me had had a crack at Eureka, and all of the big name historians, Geoffrey Blainey, Geoffrey Searle, Manning Clark, John Maloney, Weston Bate, I could keep going on. But I believed that it was beholden to for every generation to write its own history, and I also thought that I was coming from the right place in terms of writing it, which is that I had a question that was driving me. I believe that all good history comes from curiosity in the first place, and that curiosity was twofold. One was, I'd heard that women had sewed the flag at Eureka. That was part of the story that I had grown up with in terms of learning about Eureka at primary school and at high school, and then in my subsequent years as an undergraduate history student, a master's, a PhD. And yet I knew nothing about those women, and I certainly knew nothing about how their story intersected in any way with that larger story of Eureka that we had been told about the birth of democracy, about Australians having it as essential to their character to stand up for their rights and freedoms. And so I wanted to understand more about those women. I wanted to know whether there were only those three there or whether they were part of a larger contingent, and if so, what those women were doing there. Why did they come? What were their aspirations? What opportunities had motivated them? What sacrifices had they made to come on this long 3-month journey to Australia? What were their lives like out on the frontier in Victoria in the 1850s? And then indeed, what role might they have played in this iconic event that is now such an important part of Australian history and Australia's sense of itself and its development as a nation? And so I set upon this journey, and the reason it took me 10 years to write the book was not, as my colleagues believed, because there was nothing else to say and therefore there was no material that I could find. In fact, it was the exact opposite. I found so much material that eventually I had to put a full stop to my research, and I should say my book, which I didn't bring today because it's actually really heavy. It's it's 550 pages long, and I cut a good 100 pages out of it to get it down to that length. So there was an enormous wealth of information, and that is because women played a part in every aspect of goldfield society in the 1850s, far from being an exclusive male domain, a place where miners were out on the frontier, independent, free-ranging, free-roaming, out for a good time and a quick buck, which was the image that we'd had of the roaring goldfields. Women were a part of the fabric of the community. They were running shops and businesses. They were selling alcohol, selling food, selling themselves occasionally. They were working as tent keepers. They, in order so that men could go and mine, they were working as miners themselves. And because they were so intimately bound up in every aspect of the Ballarat community, they were also part of the political events that emanated from that community. And indeed, they were leaders in the Ballarat rebellion. Women were writing letters to the newspapers. They were writing letters to Governor Hotham. One woman at Eureka, Clara Seacamp, was our first female my first female newspaper editor in Australia. She edited the Ballarat Times, and there was a woman who indeed was a philanthropist. She ran the Adelphi Theatre. Her name was Sarah Hanmer, and she is the woman who contributed more money to the Diggers Defence Fund than anybody else in Ballarat. So effectively, she bankrolled the miners' movement. These are just some of the stories that ended up coming out of this book. The book was released in October last year, and it got good critical acclaim, but I must say that it didn't really get a toehold into the market until I won the Stella Prize in April 2014. And that's because there is an empirically provable bias against women writers in this country. The Stella Prize has something that it calls the Stella Count, where it actually goes through and looks at all of the book reviews that are done in our newspapers and our magazines, and it shows that on average about 70% of the books reviewed in places like The Australian, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Monthly, the Financial Review, 70% of those books are books written by men, and 70% of the reviewers are men. It's much harder for a woman writer to get attention in the press, and therefore it's harder for them to get displayed in bookstores. If you, next time you're at Melbourne Airport or any other airports in Australia, have a look at the display shelves at the front of the store to see the books that are prominently displayed and that are invited for you to buy. I will wager you that 95% of them will be written by men about topics that might be considered to be male topics. And this is despite the fact that women write books at the same rate and publish books at the same rate in Australia. So this is something that the Stella Prize is trying to raise awareness of, and it also was able to fund this prize. This is only the second year. I've been the second winner, and the progress of the Stella Prize has been extraordinary. So for me personally, after winning the Stella Prize, I was invited to speak at 12 writers' festivals this year around Australia. I've just been invited to speak at the Jaipur Literary Festival in India. I've been invited by DFAT to go on a 2-week sponsored author tour of India to represent Australia. And it was very pleasing to see that in the summer reading catalogues that have just come out, the Readings Independent Bookstore catalogue and Leading Edge, which is the booksellers catalogue, have placed my book in their section that's called Award Winners, right up there next to the Nobel Prize for Literature, the Pulitzer Prize, the Miles Franklin, and the Booker Prize. So the Stella Prize in 2 years has had an incredible hold and gotten an amazing toehold into the imagination in Australia. It's something that's really been taken to incredibly warmly. The Stella Prize is entirely funded by donations. There is no public money going into it at all. It entirely works by philanthropic goodwill. People donate anywhere from $50 to $50,000, and the list of all the donors can be found on the Stella Prize's website. And this year, the Stella Prize has been able to just launch its schools program, meaning that they are now heavily advocating for schools to start including books written by women on the curricula. It is extraordinary to find, again, this is empirically provable, that some schools in Australia, in Victoria and Melbourne, have no books written by women at all on their school curricula. And nationally, again, the statistics seem to be about 70 to 80% of the books taught to our school children are written by men. And so what does this teach our girls about what to value about themselves, their ideas, their opinions? And the Stella Prize is working to redress those issues. So again, thank you to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for giving Stella the kickstart that it needed along the way. It was an incredibly empowering and generous thing, and this is something that is going to continue to have very long-term ramifications in Australian literary culture. Thank you.